What does distinguishing excellence actually mean?
And distinguishing excellence is not really great test scores or really good grades in a very rigorous curriculum. It goes typically well beyond the accomplishments a student would have.
So how much of distinction actually comes from what you do versus how you do it and what you learn from it?
Everything is about how you do it and what you learn from it. And I understand this process is on many levels very opaque. It's very difficult to understand what the schools are looking for.
So do you feel, is it better for a student to be good at one thing, or that he or she experienced many different activities? What does distinguishing excellence actually mean from the admissions officer perspective?
So we've in some ways borrowed that terminology from Harvard, which is a term that they have historically used around the table when they are discussing an applicant. So what is this applicant's distinguishing excellence? And distinguishing excellence is not really great test scores or really good grades in a very rigorous curriculum. It isn't simply just, oh, this student was president of their class. It goes typically well beyond the accomplishments a student would have in their school to be something a little bit grander or more unique. So it can take many different forms. That's the good news. The bad news is that there really isn't kind of a blueprint to achieving a distinguishing excellence. But in essence, that's what it is. It is some type of achievement that is either quite large in terms of scale, regional, national, international, or incredibly unique.
Mm-hmm. So how much of distinction actually comes from what you do versus how you do it and what you learn from it?
I mean, everything is about how you do it and what you learn from it. There are a lot of students, and I understand this process is on many levels very opaque. It's very difficult to understand what the schools are looking for. And so students and parents really focus on the things that they know how to do. That is, in essence, easy to do, not really easy, but things like taking a rigorous curriculum, doing well in that, taking standardized test scores, doing well on those, and then getting involved in some activities and, really trying to check all the boxes, if you will. The check the box approach typically leads to a very solid but uninteresting or unexceptional, maybe is a better word to put, application. It's really when students look instead at what am I interested in? I don't love the term passion only because not everybody has a passion. I mean, I don't think I really have a passion. I have a lot of things I really enjoy doing. I don't know if I would describe any of them as true passions. And when I was 17, for sure, I don't think I had any true passions. But I had things that I was really interested in and that I spent time doing. And so I really encourage students to start there. Start with the things that they're really interested in. And if the things that they do outside of the classroom are the things that they're interested in, it is more naturally going to evolve into something that could be seen as distinguishing or a distinguishing excellence.
So at what grade do you think a student should start exploring their passion? And when is it too late?
I mean, I hate to say it's ever too late. It might be too late for the admissions process, right? Certainly the earlier the student can do that, the better. So early in high school, 9th grade, 10th grade, it might be that you're listening to this and you're saying, well, my student or I am in 11th grade, or maybe even older. Maybe you're going to be applying in your senior year. In that case, I think you could look at the things you've accomplished so far and see if there's anything else that you could do to drive them into that distinguishing excellence territory. But really the best time to start planning for this would be early in high school. So 9th grade, 10th grade is when the process typically starts.
Mhm. So do you feel, is it better for a student to be good at one thing or show that he or she experienced many different activities with depth in some and not the others?
I think yes to both. However, what
Mhm,
is not ideal is a student who does a lot of different things, doesn't go deep on any of them, and simply has some activities that they've done. I
mhm,
don't believe that everything a student does has to be in one area. Although if the student has interest in one area, and they can tie their interests
mhm,
in most of the things they do, that's probably the ideal. That is the easiest
mhm,
way to achieve a distinguishing excellence. But I've certainly worked with students who achieved a distinguishing excellence who also did things that they just really enjoyed and maybe weren't that good at. So as an example, I would say maybe they played a sport and maybe they played at the varsity level, but they weren't starters. They were never going to be recruited, but they really enjoyed that. They liked being part of a team. They loved playing the sport. They maybe knew that after they graduated from high school, they would never get to
mhm.
play it again. I want that student to continue playing that sport. I think that's really great and really valuable if they enjoy it. But it won't necessarily be part of their distinguishing excellence, but that's okay. But the easiest way to achieve a distinguishing excellence is to find ways to tie what you love into everything you do. And so,
Yes.
as an example, I might give that you really love um, music and you play an instrument. And so or maybe you sing. So
Mhm,
the voice is an instrument, right? And so maybe you want to um, sing for the school choir. You are going to try out for the more select vocal groups on campus and ideally make those. So be chosen for those. Maybe you're also
mhm,
going to participate in some competitions. Maybe you are going to connect with another student who's a songwriter and you might record original music
mhm.
that you then can upload
Yeah.
onto a streaming service. Maybe you want to volunteer at a local school where the kids want to sing or want to start their own musical group and you can help them do that. So this is an example of a student doing school groups. They're doing things outside of the school. They're doing competitions. They're doing volunteer work, but all
Mhm.
of it is in one area. That is a great example of how you could take one interest and do it in multiple different ways.
Yeah.
While, by the way, maybe still playing soccer if that's something you love, or still swimming for your school's swim team if that's something you love, or spending time baking because that's something you really enjoy doing, right? So you don't need to do everything in one area. But if you can do a lot of things in one area and go really deep, that's going to be the opportunity to be the most impactful on your applications.
Amazing. Now, there are different kinds of students in different countries with different opportunities, right? And some students have the privilege to fabricate some of these activities as well. So, how do you identify, when a student is being authentic versus when they're trying to manufacture that impact?
The things that I always looked for were certainly evidence that this is something the student enjoys doing, which I would then see because they were doing it in multiple
Mhm.
different ways. Um, a way to quantify the things that they were doing so that we could see true impact. I always talk about a lot of students are like, I'm going to start this group at my school. That is a very popular thing for students who are
Yeah.
shooting for the most selective levels to do, right? They start a group, they get a few members, they do a few things or not, and they put it on their applications and then it's gone. Whereas with the student where it's a real authentic interest, they start that organization, they start with a few members, but they grow it. They actually do accomplish things. they put a framework in place so that the organization will live on beyond them. In fact, they know what that plan is. And maybe the college that they're applying to has a similar organization and they're going to join that organization, or they've already looked into what it's going to take for them to bring that organization to their college. Oftentimes when students are less authentic, once they've checked the box, they've moved on. And so I'm also not going to hear about it. They're probably going to be less inclined to write about it in their essays because they're not going to have much to say. Or especially when the activity is more academic in nature, sometimes there's a disconnect between what they're saying is this excellence of theirs and then what they want to study and how they talk about what they want to study. So I'm not saying it's impossible to kind of project authenticity. What I am saying is that it usually falls apart on some level. The other place it can fall apart is in a letter of recommendation where you're saying that this is a real excellence for you in, let's say, science. And then one of your recommendation letters isn't even from a science teacher, or the one that you get from the science teacher is really basic, right? So there are a lot of different ways in which the authenticity will shine through, and a lot of different ways in which it won't if it's not authentic.
So how would an admission officer evaluate distinction in students from under-resourced schools versus well-resourced ones? Because clearly there is a difference in opportunity available.
Yeah, I mean, when you're reading an application, you are always trying to ascertain, what kinds of opportunities does this student have? One of the things that the colleges all ask about is your parents, their level of education, what they do for a living. And there's some information you could typically glean from that, usually more to the side of, wow, this is a student who has probably had limited opportunities based on where they go to school, their parents' education, maybe what their parents do for a living. And so you're looking at that student with an eye towards what did they do with the opportunities available to them? What were they able to accomplish? And some of these students can do incredible things, and made more incredible by the fact that that their opportunities were fairly limited. So you are taking that into consideration. And on the flip side, certainly when you could see that a student has had, they attend a very, especially in the case of private schools, an expensive private school, where many of the students are actively involved. Maybe their parents have multiple degrees, have very, intensive professions. And then the students' activities could be largely related to those professions. It's not that you're going to look askance at those accomplishments, if they feel real and they feel authentic, but maybe, you're like, well, that doesn't surprise me that the student has accomplished this. And your expectations for that student are going to be pretty high because they've had a lot of support along the way.
Okay. Now, how much role does a student's story play or the narrative play in demonstrating distinction?
And by that, you mean, can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by that?
So combine all the activities they've done and they've created a narrative, which they're putting in the essays. So can a student with a normal, regular background still lead to distinction, or what is the sort of weightage you give to a student's narrative?
Got it. Okay. So can you kind of claim to have a distinguishing excellence somehow in the way that you're writing about something? Generally, no. A distinguishing excellence either is or is not. And I've never seen a student who had pretty regular accomplishments and activities somehow spin that into something spectacular that rose to the level of distinguishing excellence. Have I seen students with great personalities really kind of have it can be difficult to make that personality shine through in your application. Can that catch your attention and make you say, oh, I just really like this kid? Yes. But in the committee room, liking the kid you know, that was not an argument that I could make to my committee chair. And when I was chairing committee and making final admit decisions, the admissions officer saying to me, I just really like this student, was not enough, right? I wanted to know, but why? How do they stand
Yeah.
out in your region amongst all of the applications that you have read? What is unique? What is special? What accomplishments has this student achieved that really make them rise to the top of these 50, 60, 70,000 other applicants that we have in our applicant pool? And if all you could point to is, well, they're, a good student with good test scores. They did some nice things. They're well liked. And I really liked the essay. It was funny. That's just not ever going to be enough to move you into the admit pile. There has to be some type of distinguishing excellence in there for it truly for you to say, yeah, this is someone we want on our campus.
And how much weightage do you give to activities that are related to the program they're applying for? Is that really important?
I think not necessarily. So it kind of depends, right? So a student could have one distinguishing excellence that, I mentioned sports in passing, but sports can be a distinguishing excellence. If you're good enough to be recruited by that school, there's a varsity level sport that you play and the coach wants you, that can be a distinguishing excellence that, coupled with, good grades and test scores, the student has accomplished. Yeah. That can be the thing that pulls you in, and your sport will have nothing to do with what you want to study. I have seen students with interesting extracurriculars that really weren't related to what they ultimately wanted to study. It is probably more impactful when the student wants to study something and the activities outside of the classroom relate to that, or they can show that they have done some things in that area, that they know what it is that they want to study, and they're more sure about it because they've had some exposure to it, and in some cases even have some accomplishments to show in it. But I do want to say distinguishing excellence does not have to be academic in nature. Sometimes it works out that way, and sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't have to. So,
okay. I see a lot of students focusing on creating a passion project.
Okay.
And how important is that? Is it relevant? Yeah.
Sorry?
I mean, passion project in the sense they are trying to curate a project related to, let's say, if they're looking at engineering, something related to maybe mechanical engineering if they're applying for it. If they're applying for medicine, something related to medicine if they're applying for it. How important is passion project? That's become the keyword in university admission.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think every student needs a passion project. Not everyone has one. Sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. I think it kind of, again, I think it's important to follow interest. So one example I would give, we talked earlier about music, and I explained a lot of different areas in which a student could get involved in music. I mean, I suppose you could argue that the passion project there might be getting together with that student who writes songs and they record music and then they put that out on to a streaming service. But I have lately seen the passion project be more about, I'm going to do research in a particular area. And again, that can be good, or it can be totally useless because it isn't actually something you're interested in. It doesn't really follow your interests, and it's something you're doing to check a box. Maybe the student who loves music also is interested in business. And so maybe instead of playing an instrument or singing, they just really love music. They love listening to music. They love new artists. They spend a lot of their time following the music industry. So with that student, perhaps what they could be doing is maybe you're going to be a music critic for your school newspaper. You could write about new artists that are coming out and new music that you have been listening to that you want to encourage other people to follow. Maybe if your school some schools have radio stations, or you could start your own podcast where you talk about new music, or you talk about classic music, whatever kind of music you're passionate about, right? You could talk about that. Maybe you could look into getting an internship in a music company where you could get more exposure to the business side of music. Maybe you could find a local musician who needs help increasing their
Mm-hmm.
social media presence, and you can learn how to do that so that you are already involving yourself in the music of business. I don't think there's a passion project anywhere in what I
No.
just described,
Yeah.
but I think it's an example of a student really finding ways to combine this one interest they have in music and this other interest that they have in business. And maybe that's what they want. They're not going to study music in college, but they want to study business in college. And then even better, maybe you find some schools that have programs that combine music, like the music of business. NYU comes to mind. They have a program like that. And now you've showcased already kind of a perfect fit for what they're doing. And you've already have some achievements in that area, right? So there's no passion project there, but there is something that could potentially be a distinguishing excellence.
Wonderful. Now, think of a high school student who's listening to our conversation, right? What is the one thing you will tell him, considering he has no profile, to build on in the next 6 months before applying to any elite university?
Well, if what year is this student? Did you just say like a ninth or a 10th
Grade,
grader?
yeah, grade 10, entering grade 11.
Okay. I think the first thing I would do is I would take a look at your list of all the things you've done so far and look for similarities. Are there a couple of things that you've done that are all in the same general area? Are they all in the same general area? Or is everything unrelated to the next? Look for commonalities. If you can find some, you're already in a better place, right? And then you want to look at what else can I do? Depending
Mm-hmm.
on what your interests are, or the
Yeah.
things that you've done, are there competitions you could enter? Are there school groups that exist that you could have joined but haven't so far that are related to this area of interest? If they don't exist, is there enough time for you to put some, to start one, but one, as I mentioned before, that is going to continue into
Yeah.
the future, right? Not just a one-off. Is there an internship you could seek out that would allow you to further explore your area of interest? If it does lend itself to a project or research of some kind, is
Mm-hmm.
that something you can get going sooner rather than later? um, the opportunities you create for yourself are typically going to be more compelling than the ones that already exist. But the student with true distinguishing excellence often is doing both.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the problem, right? Not problem, but it's difficult to achieve a distinguishing excellence because it requires a lot. And so I think another big thing that student needs to do is ask themselves, how committed am I to creating a distinguishing excellence? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's going to require a lot of energy and effort. And by the way, you still have to be doing well in school. You
Yeah.
still have to be taking a highly selected or a highly difficult collection of coursework, right? And you still need to be doing well in that. So
Yeah.
you can't do, well, I'm going to focus on my distinguishing excellence and let the other stuff slide. And you can't do the reverse either. But I think the most important thing would be to look at what you've already accomplished. Think about the things you're really interested in. If what you've accomplished doesn't relate to your interests, can you add some things
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
in that area that do relate to your interests and go from there? But make
Perfect.
a plan. If you don't make a plan, you're going nowhere.
Yeah. And as you said, a plan should start as early as grade 9 or grade
Yes.
10, right? Yeah,
Yes,
perfect.
for sure.
Yeah. Now, we spoke a lot about distinguishing excellence and that distinction that demarcates whether a student's getting admitted or not. How
Yes.
much of admissions is about finding that distinction versus ensuring students are a good fit for the university?
I think they go hand in hand
Mm-hmm.
somewhat. I think the distinguishing excellence is really a thing at the most selective levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for anyone who's listening to this and thinking, well, if you're not shooting for the most selective schools, I'm not saying don't shoot for distinguishing excellence, because that could still make you stand out and maybe lead to scholarship, additional money, things like that at other schools. But at the most selective level, you certainly are looking for the right fit, but the right fit for you at that level is a lot of times just really outstanding students with really interesting achievements so far. And, certainly if your achievements are in an area that school, and you want to study something that's not really available to you at that school. One thing that always is surprising to me is when a student is telling me, oh, I'm really interested in business. I want to study, I want hands-on business. That's what I want to study as an undergrad. And then they give me a list of schools that don't offer it, right? So you could be the most high achieving student. If that's your goal, it's going to be difficult for you to achieve that goal at a school that doesn't offer that. And it's going to be difficult for that school to see the fit if that's what you really want. And if everything you've done up to that point is showcasing, this hands-on approach to business and your desire to do that, and then you're applying and all you could really study is econ, I would argue that's a bit of a mismatch. And it's going to make it harder to imagine that student doing well at that university. So the distinguishing excellence at the most selective level is absolutely the most important. But then most of those schools are going to ask you to help them understand your fit for their institution. And that's going to be really important as well. It just comes a little later. And if you're thoughtful about your list of colleges, and then they will all make sense for you. And then the fit should be not a difficult one to figure out. So again, it's the distinguishing excellence and rising out of all those other applicants that is the most important piece. The fit comes a little bit later, but that's important as well.
What is the biggest mistake you see or you have seen in student applications?
Oh, there's so many, but I do think that students work really hard and then fall down when it comes time to translate all of those accomplishments into their application. And there are definitely many different ways in which they do that. One big one is absolutely leaving it to the last minute.
Yeah.
They write about the wrong things. And when I say that, I should caveat it because there are very few topics that I think are off limits that a student shouldn't write about. But they maybe miss an opportunity. Less than writing about the wrong thing, they miss an opportunity to provide additional information about this distinguishing excellence perhaps that they've created. And they don't even mention it maybe in their essays. And so I generally went to those essays to look for more information from the students about this area of interest that maybe I could see in their activities. And the essay could sometimes pull it all together. And then the essay was about something completely different and didn't pull it all together. Or they listed their activities in an order that diminished the importance of the thing that they did that was the most important to them, or perhaps the most impressive. And they buried it at the bottom. And maybe, depending on who's reading your file and how much time they have, they may not get to the bottom of your activity list, right? So you have to be really thoughtful about how to translate your activities and achievements into the applications in the most impactful way. So that's probably the biggest mistake that I saw students making, which is not doing a good job of that.
What would you wish students understood in a better way about, what makes them memorable to admission officers?
I think that students might be surprised that trying to imagine what admissions officers want to see rather than being authentic, that word that keeps coming up, is, admissions officers respond to authenticity. You have no idea who's going to be reading your file. The person reading your file could be a recent graduate. It could be someone in their mid-30s who just started doing admissions. This could be someone who's been doing admissions for 40 years. You really have no idea who's going to be reading your file. And with that in mind, try to be yourself. What really always got my attention, in addition to all the other things we've talked about, a distinguishing excellence, translating your activities in an impactful way, was just when I felt like I really got to know this student. By the time I finished their application, their tone in their essays was appropriate to a teenager, rather than sounding as if it had been written with a thesaurus, that's easy to say, right beside the computer when they were writing it. When they let the personality shine, I think students feel like this is such a serious process. And it's not serious. But it's okay to have some fun. It's okay to write in a way that is a little bit more fun, or about something that's a little bit more fun and not as serious. I'm thinking of a student one year who wrote about her love of country music as something she wanted the colleges to know about her. It was in a short answer. But it was one that I'd seen so many different students write about things like, I'm very diligent, I hit deadlines, I always speak up in class. Like the country music one, I could really hold on to that. That was something I could bring up in committee. And she was unafraid to be herself. And that really helped her become a little bit more memorable. So when coupled with all of those other elements, being yourself is shockingly, can be a way to be more memorable.
Students just stress themselves out beyond belief in this application process. And they'd seek help from writers to write their applications. How do you distinguish, or how easy it is for an admission officer to distinguish authenticity versus a professionally crafted application?
Well, there's a few different tells. One would be a student who is a just okay student in English and turns in an essay that is beautifully written and could be in the New Yorker tomorrow. When I think parents often stick their hands into essays, that is so evident. They put a lot of business speak in there. A lot of adult phrases show up, things that students would never say. You could spot that from a mile away. I used to circle it. Now you read online, but you might make a little addendum. I think mom or dad might have weighed in here in an inappropriate way. I know that some colleges are putting essays through, a system to see if there is AI there or not. So also not ideal. But I can't swear that you can always tell when the essay was not written by the student, but more often than not, there are some clear signals. And the best essays that I read at Penn and that I've read since leaving Penn and working with students were not necessarily beautiful pieces of writing. Maybe I read 10 to 15 really amazing essays in my time as an admissions officer. Most of them were solidly written, but not ready for the New Yorker tomorrow, and that's fine. They did a really nice job of telling the story, the student's story. And when parents get involved, that's when essays go south immediately. We lose the student voice. You're saying to the student, I don't trust you. I don't think you're good at this, so I need to do it for you. And there's almost nothing worse than undermining your student in that way at this point in the process. So please don't.
Please don't.
Absolutely. And I think it's a learning process in how to write, which benefits the students eventually in the long run at the university level. I don't know if you remember, but is there an example of a student you can give us whose distinguishing excellence came from how they approached something ordinary rather than doing something extraordinary?
Yes. I have a few of those. One that I may have mentioned in a previous podcast was a student who had a real passion. There's that word, but she really loved art, and she was an excellent artist. But she also really loved science, and basically had figured out how to combine those two. Becoming, her goal was to become a medical illustrator. So she had taken all of the sciences related to biology, chemistry, physics, and then she also took anatomy. She went to a local community college and she was taking an anatomy course there. And then she also was continuing to study art, both in school and out of school. And she started to do medical modeling on her own. And so when she was ready to apply to college, she came and did an interview with the art department and showed them her work. Many art departments will do something like that, where you could meet with a member of the art department. She showed them her work, which, by the way, had not won awards. She hadn't entered any competition. So she didn't technically have a distinguishing excellence, but her interest and the way she'd combined her interests was very unique. And she was able to speak articulately about that in her essays and in the coursework she planned to take, and how she planned to do that and use that in her future. And it was very unique, and that ended up becoming a distinguishing excellence to the point where she was admitted, and I think did a dual major in both art and science once she arrived at college. And she may ultimately have gone on to medical school. That may have been something that she was kind of considering, but that's really not unique. And she just focused on the really unique elements of her application. And I really don't know. She might be working as a medical illustrator today. She might be working as a doctor today. I'm not really sure, but I know that for the purpose of her application, those somewhat ordinary activities combined in a very unique and interesting way helped her rise out of the pool of applicants around her.
Mhm. Are there some universities that focus on distinguishing excellence and profile? And are there any universities in the elite which purely look at grades? Should students be
Not in the
researching?
US.
Not the US.
Not in the US. That's just bottom line. There are no highly selective schools in the US who are only considering grades and test scores. Not one. It's just not how the US system is designed. One big difference that I see in looking at schools in Europe, for example, and schools in the US, is the sheer volume of student clubs and activities in the US versus in, let's say, Europe, where you basically just go, you do your courses. I'm sure there are other interesting things that students do, but the way that you talk about it in the US and how important that is to the entire experience in the US means that when you are evaluating applicants, you need to bring students who are going to continue to be involved and keep that piece of your college campus and culture alive. That's what people go to the US for, the US system. And so there's really no way to simply say, oh, well, this is a great student, we're going to admit them. Just doesn't work that way.
Mhm. There are some very large universities and some are very elite colleges with small student numbers. For
Yes.
example, Claremont versus UPenn, right?
Yes.
Do all these universities have a quota for international students?
Generally, no. Most schools aren't doing quotas. They basically want to accept and enroll the most interesting class that they can.
Mhm.
They do, if they have international populations, they do certainly like to be able to say, well, we have students from 87 different countries who are going to be enrolling in this year's class. But if they don't get qualified applications from a particular country, and no one really stands out as being strong enough to come and both do the work and also be interesting and fit in with their peers, they will forego admitting students from that country that year, because they don't have to enroll students from 87 countries, right? And they're not limited to enrolling students. And if there are 5 super interesting students from Dubai in a given year, and they're interested in all 5 of them, they might admit all of them. But they might admit none of them if they're not interesting enough, right? So people have this idea like, oh, there's only one spot, or there are 5 spots. But typically, that's not the case. It's really about who is in your applicant pool, who is really interesting and accomplished that year.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. What do you wish more students understood about what makes them memorable to admission officers?
I do think it's that I wish they understood that their grades and their test scores are just a baseline. And that you're not memorable because you got a 1600 on the SAT or 36 on the ACT, or that you got straight A's, or that you took every single AP that your school offered, or that you did coursework over the summer. You know, the courses and the grades and the test scores are really important, but that's just to determine that you are qualified to do the work. What makes you memorable is everything else, right? I always talk about it, the art and science. The science is the numbers. The art is what else? What are your teachers going to say about you and how you are, what kind of a member you are of their classroom, what your level of insight is into the subject that they teach, how strong a student you are, but also what kind of a person are you? How have you followed up on your interests? What kinds of things are you doing? Or are you simply just doing school and everything else is an afterthought, right? So it's the what else that makes you memorable, not the basics. I think that is probably the biggest misconception. And I get it, because it's very easy to understand the basics, and it's very difficult to understand the what else. And to make it even more difficult, the what else that might be impressive at one school in 2026 might not be impressive in that same school in 2027, either because all of a sudden there are 100 more students with the same accomplishments, or in 2026 they really needed a piccolo player for the band or the orchestra, and then they admitted a couple who enrolled in 2027, and now they need cellists, right? And you just don't know. And obviously you can't switch from the piccolo to the cello from one year to the next. So institutional priorities play a huge role in admissions, and that's something you have no control over. So the best that you can do is put your best possible application together, be thoughtful about where you apply, and then see what happens.
Yeah. You spoke about it's not always the grades or the SAT scores, right?
Right.
But do the admission officers have so much time, especially in popular universities, to go through the applications if somebody is not meeting the grade requirement?
Different schools are going to handle that in different ways. So one thing that we did at Penn is that for students who didn't meet the basic qualities of, what we were looking for in terms of their transcripts or their test scores, that would go to something called administrative committee. So it still got read. Every application got read and still gets read. But many of those applicants might be denied without ever getting to committee, where you actually are discussing the student in committee. And other schools that have even larger numbers of applicants, or do their, not every school has a committee process. So most applications at the most selective level are typically going to be read, but they may only be read once and quite quickly. If I was looking at an application where the grades and test scores really weren't what we were expecting, I was skimming the rest to see, is there anything here that might warrant going to committee, something that we'd want to talk about, some extenuating circumstances in the student's background, some achievement that is so extraordinary. I would give as an example maybe a gold medal Olympic skater or something like that, where maybe the rest wasn't quite as strong, but wow, what an achievement. And that would be a big thing to have that student enrolled at your school. But for the most part, if they weren't cutting it in the grades and the test scores, it was a pretty cursory look. And then it was sent on to administrative committee where they were reviewed one more time and then put into the deny pile.
Perfect. Well, Beth, thank you so much. This was extremely insightful and looking forward to our next podcast coming soon.
All right.
Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.